Horror from all sides that culminates in everybody losing. In our first session, we almost TPK'd from goblins. At the end of that session, we level up and arrive at the town where the Paladin NPC joins us. The DM says, "I'll help you out since it looks like you're having a rough time." Our next mission is to infiltrate a zombie bandit hideout under an abandoned mansion. At first, it looks like another TPK with the bandits hitting pretty hard, but then the DMPC slowly pulls out his holy sword and smites everything in sight. Out of character, I know this is a holy avenger. I have a talk about how OP this is for level 2, and the DM says, "Well, do you not want the help?" As expected, the DMPC Paladin shines in every fight. We feel like backup dancers. This keeps going until level 3, where we're all annoyed by this point. During the night, we plot to steal the sword. We stab him in his sleep, and the DM says, "PvP is not allowed. You can't murder Hobo your ally and steal his sword. I don't want to continue DMing for you guys anymore." Wow, the DM who created a Mary Sue NPC to steal the spotlight from the party doesn't want to DM for them anymore? Oh no, what a tragedy. Yeah, this party is definitely not missing out on much with this Dungeon Master. Next thing you're gonna tell me is the DMPC was also a lawful stupid paladin. Hi everyone, let me tell you a tale. The tale of the blank character sheet. This happened a few years ago, and I don't think everyone involved was really all that terrible, but it is a fun story, and I think you all might enjoy it. This was a pre-written module, which one is not really important, and the only real character of the story to note is the Warlock. The Warlock in this campaign always seemed pretty passive to me, in that for basically the whole campaign, they never used a single spell, subclass ability, pact boon, or eldritch invocation, aside from Agonizing Blast. In combat, they only ever used Eldritch Blast. But I figured they just wanted to play their Warlock that way, and I didn't want to play their own character for them. We were almost done with the campaign at a certain point. After a few months at level 7 out of 8, at the end of the campaign, we were at a very difficult combat encounter. The Warlock said something along the lines of, "Well, I can't do anything. I'll just use Eldritch Blast," on their turn. This is where the Warlock started to fall apart a bit. In passing, I said, you could cast a spell if you didn't want to use Eldritch Blast. There was some mumbling from the Warlock, and after a long pause, they tried to cast Wall of Fire in a way that would involve friendly fire on our party. After the DM explained that, the Warlock changed the placement of the Wall of Fire instead. Later in that encounter, people were making death saves, and the Warlock said on their turn something like, "I wish I could help, but all I have is Eldritch Blast." They were playing a Celestial Warlock, and having played one before, I mentioned that they could use their first level ability to heal some of the characters that were down if they wanted to, as a bonus action. Cue some more mumbling and then a single roll of a 1d6, not necessarily how the ability works, and the Warlock says, "Okay, player X, you gain 4 hit points, and I just used my second level spell slot, so I can't use that again." The first level Celestial Warlock ability does not require the use of a spell slot. It has its own resource, and at level 7, the Warlock can use it 7 more times. I tried to explain, without trying to be a rules lawyer, that that's not how the ability worked. But I stopped after the Warlock started ranting about how complicated keeping track of all the spells and abilities is. One of the other players tried to suggest looking at their character sheet on Roll20, where the spells were listed, and that the character mancer can build it for them. And the Warlock got even more heated about it. The other player backed off and said, okay, that's fine, I was just suggesting it. At this point, the DM speaks up and says that they just took a look at the Warlock's character sheet on Roll20, and it is completely blank. The only thing there is hit points and the Eldritch Blast cantrip. We are all a bit silent for a moment, and the DM steps away for a break, clearly exasperated. The rest of the session went by a bit awkwardly, and we really only had 1 or 2 sessions left in the campaign, so this was kind of swept under the rug for the rest of the game until it was over. The Warlock was not a new player and had played D&D before. This was also not their first campaign on Roll20. I still don't really know why they didn't try to use Roll20 or ask for help with it, use D&D Beyond, some other online character sheet creator, or even just a physical character sheet, but I still remember how dispirited the DM sounded when they said to the group that the Warlock's character sheet was blank. After that campaign was over, the DM did not invite the Warlock back to the next campaign. As a DM, I understood the feelings that our DM had. I just felt so bad for our DM to put all that effort into running the campaign, the prep, and the story for one of the players to have a completely blank character sheet and not make any attempts to learn how their class works. I don't entirely have the warlock side of the story, but it just felt disrespectful. Anyway, it's not as bad as some of the other ones on here, and I hope that the warlock is having fun playing D&D, or in general is doing well. They weren't a bad person at all. I liked them as a person, and I actually enjoyed playing with them most of the time. But I think at a bare minimum, you need to fill out a character sheet if you want to play Dungeons and Dragons. We have been having a bit of a theme recently with inattentive players. Last episode of the series, we had Wall, another player who just didn't really seem to care about the campaign and wasn't putting their attention into it, wasn't focused, wasn't engaged, and I'll say the same thing every single time. While no, this isn't some morally abhorrent behavior, this isn't on the level of inceldom, for example, but this still does absolutely suck, especially for Dungeons and Dragons. When you're playing D&D, I say this all the time for a reason, it requires some level of engagement. You need to engage and participate in the game in order for it to work. If you don't, the game kind of falls apart and the vibe of the group is brought down significantly when you're just sort of sitting there like a brick. This isn't as bad as Wall from the last campaign. Wall didn't participate in the story or the game at all. The Warlock clearly did, at least at some points. They just participated in a very, very minute way, just casting Eldritch Blast. I think with all the effort the DM is putting into making this game happen, you can at least put some effort into learning your own class. I love D&D, but I've run into one of those horror stories I never thought I'd experience. Writer's block. After a good while of writing nothing but fantasy, I guess I'm getting burnt out. I still love the classic fantasy settings, but maybe something new will spice it up for me. Thank God for Penny Dragon Games and WayStar. That's right, this video is sponsored by Penny Dragon Games and their newest Kickstarter, WayStar, a full conversion of Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition to a sci-fi universe. This isn't just your everyday homebrew hack. This Kickstarter includes a core rulebook for both players and GMs, a creature codex with over 100 new monsters and many more planned, and a new galactic setting with everything you need to get your game off the ground. If you guys are feeling a little bit roguish, you can jump into Steal the Stars, an epic space heist adventure set in the universe of WayStar. If all of that is not enough to convince you, WayStar was backed in 30 minutes. That's just simple statistics, and you can't argue with simple statistics. So if you're interested, you can head down into the description down below or go down to the pinned comment where you can pick up Penny Dragon Games WayStar for yourself. 3 lucky backers will be getting everything on the Kickstarter. So if you're interested in that, or you just generally want an awesome sci-fi adventure to toss your D&D party into, then check out this amazing new conversion. As always, supporting our sponsors does support us. Thank you so much to Penny Dragon Games for sponsoring today's video. With that, I'm going to turn back into an animated rat so that we can get back to the video. I joined this campaign half a year ago, and I'm still in it, and it's great, but back around when I joined, another quite peculiar player joined with me. I'll jump past any unnecessary details, since I know these stories tend to get bloated with those. For context, the campaign is set in this alternative world with fantasy stuff, and all the characters are just regular people going to school for adventuring. The subject of our story made a tiefling with fire magic or something like that, and went around in a dark hooded mask to try to hide their identity, so we'll just call them Anon. Anon really didn't have any big red flags, besides not seemingly getting the idea that going around hiding your face on the first day of school was a bit weird, but we all just kind of let it go and assumed it was a character quirk. First session. All the characters are seated next to each other in a big room for a speech, and they all make some mild conversation, except Anon, who gives a single one-word response and ignores all other attempts anyone makes to interact with them. Some big metal worm things fall from the ceiling. People flee, except one guy who the DM spells out to obviously be sus. He stays and watches for a couple of rounds before leaving. Anon makes around 2 or 3 attacks before deciding to go hide. The rest of the players finish combat. No one knows where Anon went, and so they leave the room to go find out what happened and where Anon is. From here on out, the session went 50-50, with half of it being used just to see what Anon was doing, while the players tried to track down the sus student and the principal to explain what happened using spells and investigation rolls and whatnot. Anon begins following the janitor who's cleaning up the robot stuff. At this point, as Anon didn't bother even introducing themselves to the party, no one knows who they are, and Anon seems uninterested in changing that. Instead, Anon follows the janitor as he extracts some green stuff from the robots and goes to give it to another teacher. Meanwhile, the other players were figuring out clues on their own, and both groups were kinda at a point where they needed to figure out their next step, and it might have been a good idea to get the two groups together here. But while the players try to say they ask around for Anon decides to go to the office of the teacher they saw taking the green stuff. It is at this point that I should mention, Anon did not take failure well. Whenever a roll went poorly or a ruling didn't favor them, they'd whine and complain until the DM either caved or another player stepped in to side with the dungeon master. We had seen Anon show this behavior in combat, but I think we all only realized that it was going to be here to stay when they started complaining for 15 minutes when the teacher with the green stuff escaped from their sight. Anon lockpicked the teacher's office, found it empty, saw papers with their name on it, and decided to steal them. No explanation, nothing related to what they came for, just decided to open a file cabinet and go through papers and then take something with their name on it, which was, in fact, just a simple student file. The teacher approaches their office, Anon casts invisibility, and it is at this point that you'd think Anon would leave, but another thing about Anon, they'd often just talk over the DM and therefore not fully realize what was going on because the DM didn't get to finish. In general, it seemed like Anon wasn't paying attention but was also annoyed whenever their lack of information screwed them over. So, Anon casts Mage Hand to push something over to distract the teacher. The DM informs them that they will lose invisibility. Cue 10 minutes of whining and complaining before the DM agrees to just rewind. Now you'd think, with more time, Anon would just walk out the open door, but no. Anon goes to push something over with their own hand, and is suddenly very surprised that the teacher, at a magical school of adventuring, sees something suddenly fall over in their empty room and then casts See Invisibility. At this point, no one in the call has any clue what Anon is trying to do. Anon manages to argue their way into being allowed to leave the room and dash away before the teacher can do anything to stop them, but the teacher just walks out the door and casts Sleep on them. After failing to argue that the teacher shouldn't be able to cast it since they're invisible, Anon instead uses 20 more minutes to argue that it is unethical for a teacher to cast Sleep on a student just because they're stealing from an office and casting a spell on them is basically assault. Meanwhile, the other players have all been making attempts at finding Anon and roleplaying, but since no one knows anything about them and Anon isn't communicating anything to them or even making any attempt to find them and has been sneaking around the school specifically unseen, it is futile. And the session ends and we level up. Next session. At the very start of the session, Anon wakes in a basement, tied to a table because unbeknownst to them, the teacher they were following alone and without communicating their activities to anyone had actually been the BBEG. Anon conveniently assesses their situation before picking what spell they learned for their level up, which is Misty Step. They teleported out of the restraints, hide behind some barrels, wait for the teacher to come open the door, and, I mean, you'd think Anon would have learned their lesson by now, but no. Anon does not go invisible or even try to run. They attack the teacher, lose half their health in one turn, try to run without disengaging, and get downed by the opportunity attack. And then, after a moment of silence, they simply go, I don't think this campaign's for me, guys. Yeah, I just don't like the style of the DMing. And then, while the entire call sits stunned in silence at the deflection, they hang up the call and leave the Discord, never to be seen again. Now, I really want to stress, this is not the DM's fault. Had Anon done anything to communicate with the other players, they would have survived. Admittedly, there was no cell service in the basement they were tied up in, which we learned after they tried something smart and opened their phone to call for help. But if they had just stuck with the other players until after the first encounter and waited for them to all exchange numbers, they could have just split off from the party if they really wanted to and just updated them on what they had found. In that way, the party would at least have clues in order to follow Anon if they stopped replying, but instead, Anon just made no effort to interact or work with the other players for their entire playtime, then suffered the consequences and rage quit. After we all reassured the DM that this wasn't a problem on their part, but on the player's part, we just kind of moved on and the campaign is still going strong today. A few additional notes of interest. After the first session, I stuck around and talked to Anon to get their vibe, and unprompted, they just went on for several hours about how great and amazing their parents were, which I really admired. That was sweet and all, but for my life, the only thing I could do to change the topic was excuse myself from the call entirely. Anon also played the entire game on their phone, in public. The first session they played on a bus, and the second, dude was playing on an airplane with strangers sitting next to them. Still to this day, the strangest player I've ever had the pleasure to play with. But other than an inability to grasp that D&D is a multiplayer game and the refusal to accept failure and responsibility, they seem like a nice enough person. I hope they learned about video games or something and plays those instead now. We have had a player like this once before, a speedrunner, somebody who takes the whole I need to win at D&D thing even farther than it already is. Look, first and foremost, D&D isn't just about winning. D&D is about telling a story with your friends. I think we all know this. The real victory is creating that story with your buddies, those epic memories that you're going to remember for years to come. That's what's important. Often, this mentality of I need to win, I need to get the victory, that gets in the way of that story, and Anon clearly has that problem. But on top of that, the guy is clearly trying to speed run the DM's adventure. How? I don't know. Maybe the guy had meta knowledge or something. As for the why, I also don't know. It seems like a really stupid endeavor that he's putting a lot of effort into. I mean, who the hell plays D&D on a plane? And how the hell? Do you have Wi-Fi on the plane? Anyway, I'm not gonna put any more thought into this. Next story. A little bit of backstory. I joined a play-by-post campaign through Discord that was essentially run as Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, but it was a world that the DM is trying to turn into her own role-playing game and system as time goes on. She has a website set up for it, and multitudes of articles on homebrew gods, races, locations, groups, maps, etc. All in all, it's a massive amount of passion poured into this unique project, and you can really tell this is something the DM and her wife are very much proud of and in love with. They regularly would advertise their campaigns through a couple of different forums, opening up an application process via Discord, along with some time for their current players to get to know the newbies and decide who would be the best fit with the group. Definitely very thought out and a careful approach to try and ensure a safe place for people to have fun and get along well. And the other players were always great and very fun to play with. I had a great time with all of them. They were very sweet and funny, so much so in fact that it was always a surprise when people would get kicked out of the group for seemingly no reason. At first you'd think, oh, maybe they actually were mean people. Okay, oh well. But as time went on, so many people got kicked out. It was a regular thing for the DM and her wife to look for applicants in their games. I wasn't an original player to their games, and although I definitely liked all the other players, I felt a little apprehensive talking about my feelings regarding the matter when it came to players who were there before me. I wasn't sure if they felt the same way I did, or if they had some weird allegiance to the DM and her wife that would turn on me if I happened to ask about the common kicks. As time went on, it became very clear that the DM and her wife were the ones creating a toxic environment, not the players. They would get more and more upset every time they kicked people, to the point where it became impossible for them to recognize their way of handling issues or lack of compromise in the game environments was making it hard for people to have fun. To play in their games, you had to first acknowledge the fact that the DM's wife's character would always be a plot device, not just a character. If you were not receptive to her character or the very self-indulgent roleplay she insisted on, you were out. If your character was the least bit more dominant than hers was, you were out. If there was a little bit of character headbutting, she'd bring it into out-of-character arguments, and yeah, you were out. I've seen her warn players out of character for things they did in character that were misunderstood or misconstrued. If anyone dared try to stand up for themselves or explain why their character behaved the way they did, they were thrown out. One very self-indulgent scene we participated in was a ceremony in which we all pledged loyalty to the DM's wife's werewolf character, despite knowing that her character had in the past killed many NPCs and even a player character when they got kicked out of the group. we were to first discover that she was a werewolf, then basically say we'd always protect her and stay by her side. This included the ranger in the group, whose character suffered a traumatic werewolf attack in the past and did not have any reason to trust them going forwards. Despite the scene being very long, personalized to her entertainment only, and full of cringe, we all just kind of went with it for fear of retribution. There was one player that I still feel bad for. She was brought into our group a bit later in the game at around level 7, and she was playing a shifter monk. Because she had no connection to any of our past adventures, I could tell it was pretty hard for her to roleplay along with the group at first, and spent a few months in the game roleplaying, shopping, and traveling, and us getting our task while also discussing our previous one. When we finally got to our first combat session since she joined, literally months after she joined, we killed a few cultists that summoned 2 big alligator vine creatures. Googling it now, I'm 99% sure they're the Fey-Meyer crocodiles pulled directly from this Critical Role article. One of the bosses literally swallows the monk immediately. We freak out in the out-of-character chat. We tried thinking of ways to get her out, guessed at about how many rounds it would take to kill her, tried to think of ways to get heals into a stomach. The DM's wife went into disciple mode, telling us to stop metagaming, or the DM will have to metagame back, telling us how dare we assume how getting swallowed works, etc, etc, etc. We tried to fireball the things. We tried so hard to kill them in time, but literally the round before we killed it, the monk had taken too much bludgeoning and acid damage and died before she had a chance to even roll enough death saves. Since the group wasn't even aware that her character was a shifter, she had shifted inside the creature since she thought it would be a cool reveal for them, once they were removed from the crocodile's body. We asked the DM if we could override the rule that says you shift back to normal form when knocked out. The DM said no. I just can't believe it. DM just up and kills a character in their first encounter, claiming there was nothing she could do to stop it, claiming she felt bad about it, and then to top it all off, refused to even let her have a satisfying roleplay shifter moment at the very end. The player was somewhat absent from the game for about a week. I wanted to message her to ask her how she feels, but I was afraid to, as if somehow my objection to her being treated like that would somehow make its way back to the DM and subsequently get me kicked out. I don't know. I feel like I can't sum up my issues with the DM and her wife enough here to make others fully understand what kind of awkward cringe happened on the daily. I don't normally complain about my experiences in campaigns, and I also know character deaths happen, and I know that all DMs treat something like that differently, and most of the time, I'm not bothered. I'm in something like 4 other campaigns at the time, and totally don't feel this way about any of the other ones. I think it's a combination of the DM and her wife being unreasonable and lacking self-awareness, plus the fact they use their sessions as personal therapy and flip out if things don't go as planned. I found my way out of the campaign and left with no intention to return. I stayed in contact with nobody. From what I hear, others saw the opportunity and left as well. It doesn't look like they're running the game right now. I have friends who've never played with them who reassured me constantly that nothing they ever did was logical or fun and that I should have left a long time ago. And they're the ones that actually directed me to this subreddit. I just don't understand how you can kick so many people out of your campaigns for so long and never once realize the common denominator. This really turned into a long vent, huh? If there's one thing I learned from it, it's that RPGs are a combination of the DM's and the player's enjoyment, not some self-indulgent power trip for the dungeon master. I just feel frustrated seeing so many people try to talk sense to the DM/her wife that I know if I tried as well, it probably would have been useless. Instant bans from D&D are not something I hand out lightly, not something I've handed out ever at all, and these ladies are handing them out like candy. It's important to talk it out when you have an issue in your game. Of course, there are things that go way too far, but from the looks of it, these ladies just wanted some main character syndrome to themselves and didn't like it when people got in the way. It's a shame. They seem to work really hard in this game, and clearly people are having a degree of fun to stay this long, but I think it's for the best that OP ended up walking in the opposite direction. This is going to be a weird one, so hang tight. I'm into wet look. It's a mild turn on, which basically makes me turned on when I'm swimming or bathing with my clothes on. It's harmless and I mostly keep it to myself. But for the past few months, I've also been writing ridiculous, over-the-top erotic stories about it online. Initially, I just did it for fun, but eventually people started offering money for customs, so I turned it into a side hustle. It's been pretty lucrative so far. Recently, my D&D group started a new campaign, and the DM told us to send him our backstories for review, and I accidentally sent him one of the erotic stories I had written. I deleted the message, praying he didn't have the time to download it. Then I sent him the correct file, and he just responded with a thumbs up. My God. I definitely pity OP here. Obviously, I've never written erotic stories for obvious reasons, but if I did and I accidentally sent it to somebody, I think that shame would be with me for eternity. I thought I was out of the woods. Then came the first session. I was the only girl in the group, the rest were guys, with the exception of the host's wife, who didn't play but stayed to watch. I was playing a human sorcerer, and I had her wear some fancy robes she had stolen from a noblewoman at some point. It was a desert campaign, and the first encounter involved an oasis. After we defeated a band of minor jackalwares there, the DM states I feel some kind of power emanating from the center of the oasis. I ask if there's a way to get to the center of the oasis without swimming, and the DM says there were some rocks sticking out of the water, which I could traverse. I ask how many rocks there were, and the DM says 10. I decide to jump from rock to rock in an attempt to get to the source. DM has me do a dexterity check for every damned rock. I succeed the first 3, then fail the 4th. As I fall into the oasis water, the DM describes how my robes become wet, change color, and become heavy, and then asks me if I want to stay in the water or try and get out. It felt kind of off, but I brush it off and just say, I swim over to the source. We discover the source of power is some kind of portal, and at some point we go through and find ourselves in some kind of underground temple. Fast forward a few minutes, and there is a pool of water between us and another door, with a narrow rope bridge leading across. We decide to traverse the bridge one by one, with me last. And guess what? The bridge breaks, and I end up in the pool. As I clamber out to the other side and walk towards the rest of the party, the DM proceeds to vividly describe how my dripping wet clothes wrap around me, squeaking as I walk, and so on. At this point, I'm uncomfortable and ask him to stop, because it's kind of weird. The other guys agree. He frowns, but admits he's gone too far. The next week, we have another session. We're still in the temple, and we're facing some water elementals. Because of course we are. Their attack targets me more often than I'd like, and the DM again remarks on how wet I am. At this point, I'm about to speak up when the host's wife tells the DM to stop, because I'm visibly uncomfortable. The DM throws a fit, picks up his stuff, and leaves. I'm still not sure why he did this. It's statistically unlikely that we share the same kink, so I just think this was some poor attempt to, seduce me. Whatever the case, we never played with him again. What did I just read? I mean, to be fair, she did warn us. And yes, that was extremely weird. What the DM was doing was obviously unacceptable for a multitude of reasons. While this didn't gross me out viscerally, as many others did, I think you guys call it crashingcrispy.exe, I think that's what you all call it. But anyway, that didn't happen. However, doesn't stop the fact that this is really gross. Like I've said many times, D&D is not a brilliant avenue for seduction, and it probably never will be. It's gross, it's weird, it makes people uncomfortable, and thank God that in this case, it ended quickly. Alright, I think that's going to be it for today. If you guys enjoyed this episode of RPG Horror Stories and want to let me know, then please do leave a like. If you want to see more of my content, then you can check out our Q and Play series where I answer your questions while playing some video games. It's linked in the cards, and while you're there, subscribe to Crispy's Tavern to get more of our content right as it comes out. And finally, if you want to leave your own stories or thoughts, go down into the comments down below. If you can't think of a comment, leave the comment water seduction to let me know you made it to the end of the video. And that's like, comment, subscribe. I will see you all next time. Farewell.